buildings and how they're affected by the various things that are around the built environment, whether that's codes or sustainability goals or other policies. So I'm happy to be here, and I think I get to share in the second half. So Tiffany's going to go first, and I think I go second.
Well, actually, Julie and Andrew and Jennifer are going to go first because we're going to look at everybody's homework assignments. So both people submitted some homework assignment ideas, and spoiler alert, you guys have the exact same homework assignment today. So it's just more good ideas is the homework assignment. So hopefully what you're hearing today helps you build upon what you've already thought of and inspires you to dig even deeper and further. So all good ideas have been shared. So let's look at the presentation, Andrea, and just start talking about them. Ideally, we would have each group member speak to the work that they had proposed themselves, but since a lot of people can't be with us this evening, I can go through some of the ideas that were presented. So,
and I'm just glad too that we're recording so that nobody had those surprises, and every meeting will be recorded. So those who are not able to attend, I've already had people asking if they can go through the link and watch.
That is a super valuable reminder. Thank you, Andrea. I will strive to refrain from bagging on Houston too frequently throughout the course of this presentation. So first and foremost, the idea to represent the history of the site was proposed for some component of built work within the new Hillcrest. So on the lower left image there, that was a picture that was submitted by Donna Peterson. And it was the thought that making sure that people knew, even as you walk through the site 50 years from now, that this used to be a golf course and that this necessarily ended up becoming a Jewish-only golf course, and the reason why it became a Jewish-only golf course. It was converted to an exclusively Jewish community of golfers in the 1940s. Right on the heels of the anti-Semitic movement that was coming with World War II. So it's an important part of this global history that has played itself out on the landscape of the East Side in St. Paul. And it is a really valuable piece of information to make sure is being kept alive, regardless of what ends up getting built on the site down the line. So this sign in particular on the lower left, is that worth putting somewhere else? Can we come up with a way to make it less about wayfinding and more about its historical context? So that's a question for how can we repurpose some of these, let's call them site relics, for a new and interpretive use. Julie is on the call. So Julie, do you want to tell us why you submitted this picture of Mears Park in the lower right?
Mears Park came to me right away, just because I feel like there's always some liveliness going on there. There's, you know, every time we go to a restaurant in that area, you always see people walking their dogs and hanging out, and it seems, it has a lot of naturalness to it that I really like. And then, you know, all the events that are always going on. I just really think that would be a great concept to bring into this area, where you know, could have events and music and things like that. I always enjoy that.
That sounds great. I really like the phrase that you use, more than just a walking path, and just always bearing that in mind. So that really speaks to program and making sure that a lot of our public spaces and public adjacent spaces have more than one thing happening in them at all times, to keep them lively and to keep them activated. So, and it's also interesting that you use the word natural at Mears Park, because it's a highly engineered landscape, actually. So it's really, really fascinating to think about such a highly controlled and engineered space that ends up having this very naturalistic aesthetic. And which means that in an example like Hillcrest, where we have to remediate the crud out of it because it's contaminated with mercury, and there's going to be a huge amount of earthwork and just rearranging everything, that we still have the capacity to achieve this really naturalistic and thriving ecology when it's all said and done. So it's a really good benchmark to strive toward. Frankie, you're on the call. Hi, welcome. We were going around the room and talking about the homework submissions that we shared. And one of the pictures that we took out of your submission was this one in the middle left here, where you're expressing what's happening on the inside of the building, on the outside of the building. And we're wondering if you could just share a few words about why you selected this project.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So this project is a youth project, a youth building. It was geared towards homeless youth, specifically indigenous youth. But obviously, it's not restrictive. Um, but what I like with the building is just how colorful it is on the outside, and they incorporate a lot of native ideas and themes inside and outside, especially on the inside. And all the programming and things were also native related. Um, but I know the inside is not really doesn't really say much about urban design. So the outside is what I've kind of focused on because proximity, first of all, is if you, as you can see right there, that's the green line. So it's like right on the green line. So that's transportation is a big part of urban design, and just the way the building is shaped, the form it conforms to the other commercial buildings around the area.
Yep.
But it also stands out because it's so different from the other buildings. So it stands out and is also kind of conforming. So I thought that was a very interesting aspect of the building.
And I think that's a really great goal to strive for, except especially along the Larpenteur corridor, where we do have a higher traffic, higher visited edge to the site. And how can we introduce something that's colorful and trying to be iconic to that edge condition there that has a really strong, like, welcome to Hillcrest vibe to it. And another great thing about this example that you've picked out is that it does start letting you know what's happening on the inside of the building, even though it was probably an affordable housing project that was operating on a pretty strict budget. You still get the sense of who it's serving and how it fits into the community, rather than it just being a soulless box. So really good. Serenity is not on the call, I don't believe. So Serenity submitted this article in the upper left. There is an image from it, and it's this really fun article about a new development in Arizona that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, that is proposing to not have any parking available for all 1,000 residents that they are projecting to have on the site in Arizona. And I think that that's like the part that's extra mind-boggling to consider. But just the general concept of taking all of that space that we set aside for cars, and like, what would our neighborhoods look like if none of that was necessary anymore and we could reallocate that space for people? What would we do with it? I think everybody knows that like 1/3 of LA is parking lots. What would LA be like if there were no parking lots? Because we didn't need parking lots. It is a problem and a challenge that's bigger than any one person in this group, but a really fun, exciting thing to consider. And then, excuse me, Susan Bergman, she submitted the image on the upper right there about the community unity art sculptures. And so that's a very specific example of how an artwork can be made up like a quilt work or a quilt amalgamation of people's ideas and visions to come together into a testament of what a community values and what they represent. And I think the essence of this sculpture could be applied in hundreds, if not thousands, of different ways. So does it have to be a tile, or could it be some other kind of modular piece of architectural material that comes together into some sort of large artwork sculpture that can be enjoyed by the entire community? And on the next slide, we have a couple submissions on the upper left here from Rachel Finazzo Dahl, who's also not on the call with us, but really about like different types of architectural aesthetics. So on the upper left, that's a infill project That's only 2 to 3 years old, she said, but it's very much trying to stay in keeping with the existing neighborhood architectural fabric. And then in a hard pivot in the opposite direction, we have these hyper modern architectures in the middle left that are really speaking toward the sustainability objectives and net zero goals of the community. So what's the more appropriate architectural language to use on this site that is supposed to be a very sustainable carbon-free neighborhood? And then Andrew, the remaining 4 pictures came out of your very, very thorough submission. So I was hoping, and a lot of them we're going to save for next time, because a lot of people's homework submissions had more to do with what's happening at the block and street level and starting to bleed into public spaces, and less about what's happening, what we're talking about today on with lots and buildings. So can you give us a sense of what you were thinking about with materiality and this really interesting project on the lower left?
Yeah. So I chose just 2 materials with a few images, brick and wood. And basically brick is just sort of what I would consider kind of a warm, human scaled material that I think always adds a sense of permanence to whatever you're creating with it. And there's infinite number of ways it can be used, and orientations of it, and you can create texture with the surface patterning of it. And so I just added that in as one of the materials. Wood also, it is again sort of a more warmer material that I think is always welcoming, and specifically the image that's there was one where I thought it was really interesting how they left the wood untreated, and it just starts to weather and patina over time, sort of like copper will turn green over a number of years. And I like the idea of embedding a sense of time into the actual cladding of the structure that you're creating. The bottom left is this was where I was talking about sort of creating a node of some sort, but doing it in a way where it's not really specifically programmed to be one type of thing. This is in Ghent in Belgium. They just, in one of the many squares they have there, they created this basically canopy. It feels almost like a building because it has sort of gabled forms to it, and it's a very massive structure, but it really is just sort of a canopy that throughout the day it takes on a number of different uses. You have a farmer's market in there. There's people come and play music and just gather. It's a meeting place, for people coming into the city to meet before they go out wherever they're going. It's a sculptural form in a way, so it serves so many different uses. I thought it was a really interesting example of what sort of a node could be. And then
project. We were wondering where it was from.
The last image was just an idea of illumination, and this particular one is in Boston, where it's sort of a sculptural piece, but each one of these glass tubes has a little propeller basically on the top of it. So as the wind blows, the amount of wind changes the amount of light coming out of these tubes, so it's constantly fluctuating. And again, it's a way of tying sort of your immediate environmental surroundings into a visual connection of place. And I thought that was a really pretty example of that.
It's a pretty one. Donna, now that you're on the call, should we flip back and have you speak to your image that you shared earlier?
Hang on one second, Tiffany. I just want to say, Andrew, and any of the others, if you guys have taken a tour or been able to visit Capital Region Watershed District's new headquarters building over on University in the Midway, they have a kinetic sculpture that's very impossible to describe. inside the building, in the ceiling, but the kinetics of that sculpture respond to the on-site stormwater management and reuse system that had been installed on the roof and the site of that building. And so I personally am very interested in this idea of how do we make the invisible visible? How do we daylight these metrics and these numbers and these sustainable designs that we strive for, these signs of community vitality? How do we translate them into the visible form, taking these intangible things and making them tangible? And I think that's a great example, and would be very interested in figuring out something super cool like that for the hub, that the node, if you will, that ties those disparate elements together. It's I think difficult to pull off, but when done well, it really creates a sense of place.
Yeah. And I apologize. I do have to dip out to go to another meeting now, but I will watch the recording when it's posted, and I look forward to seeing everybody else's pictures. Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you in 2 weeks, Andrew. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Hi there, Donna. Are you able to tell us a little bit about the photo in the lower left?
Yes. Heather, you said, or me?
Donna.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I remember, is it Monty?
Mm-hmm.
Monty saying a picture says 1,000 words, and I was looking to think of pictures, and then all of a sudden I thought of the real thing that's on my mind, which is I feel like we're losing something really that was really cool. I've been in the neighborhood 35 years, and I knew somebody who got to join Hillcrest once they opened it up, and guy actually got to play there, and it was just a lot of history, and I just feel like golf courses are going away, and so I did send everybody my thoughts about it, but this is just a significant picture of what is on my mind. We need to preserve that that history, because the Jewish people who bought it because they were not able to get into other private golf clubs, and there were plenty of them back then, and everything was pretty segregated in a lot of ways back then, and it didn't matter. It wasn't about color. It was about where you came from and what nationality you were, and given all of the stuff that's going on in persecution of, I shouldn't say persecution, but just trying to forget some of our history, which I think is kind of throwing away the baby with the bathwater. We had racism, but boy, there's racism that exists in other countries, way worse than our country. And I want to see some of the things that we had back, that was definitely a part of our culture, but also there was a reason for it being formed. And it was funny because I said to my sister who lives in Hawaii, I was telling her about, I got to be a part of this, and I was telling her about Hillcrest, and she said, "Oh, those Jewish people who got their own golf course." And I said, "Yeah, but did you realize why?" And so I think a lot of people don't understand that, and I think it's good to give that history back, and that's all. And also to represent the community that has been around for a lot of years. And I'm not kidding you, I've been here 36, and people on either side of me have been here. Some of them, one neighbor longer, and one neighbor maybe 25 years. And even the townhouses across the street were occupied by the same people for a lot of years. And I just think there's a lot to be remembered in our community about preserving our community and what it represented, but also I think there's a little bit being lost as far as being in Maplewood. You're not part of North St. Paul, you're not part of East St. Paul, and I don't want this to be all, this is an East St. Paul thing, because I think it's part of Maplewood too.
Yes, it's very
That
much a
makes sense.
central location that a lot of people have been enjoying for many, many years. So,
Yeah.
And I
thank
would
you.
add to that too, kind of the conversation. I think it is important to have this documented in the notes, the importance of looking at the history of the neighborhood. So with the community engagement that we did previously, we heard similar things to what you're saying, Donna. And at the same time, we really had a strong group a group of ideas that were coming through that also talked about the Dakota land that this was even prior to that. It's so
Oh,
how do
wow.
we incorporate the past and the future? And so there was some really great ideas that came out of that exercise as well. So I definitely want to say that make sure that those two conversations come in together. That there's this evolution, but making sure we keep going back to what was there before, and knowing that there was this history from the 1920s, 1930s, and then there was this history before, the 1880s. I don't know the exact timing. So to get that on the record, I think is good.
Yes.
Yep, I agree. I wonder if there's some mounds out there in that golf course. Because there sure is hilly in places,
Yeah.
Man-made ones at this point.
To our understanding, the entire topography of the golf course is incredibly sculpted and man-made in the very recent 20th century. But thank you, Donna. And then we have one more submission just under the wire.
Oh,
But we
let me.
got there. So that's flipping over to the other set. So Jennifer, would you like to share a little bit about the images that you put together for us? Maybe if we zoom out so we can see.
Is that better?
There we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, so this was a development in Berlin, a fairly recent development, I think, in Berlin. And I thought it was really interesting because I went kind of spelunking, looking for mixed use, and then I decided to see if I could tighten it up with light industrial and see what kind of stuff that brought up, which was an interesting assortment. But I really liked this, and I thought they had an interesting kind of definition for light industrial. But the different pictures of it give you, I would love to walk around this place, honestly, give you very different views of it because it's clearly an infill development. And Berlin is a very interesting city. East Berlin and West Berlin, at least a few years ago, were still very distinct architecturally. That East Germany and West Germany had gone some very different architectural routes in the 20th century. And it's an interesting infill because it does look modern and it has a lot of kind of curvy lines to it. It doesn't look like a bunch of blocks stacked on top of each other. And it plays with color. And I don't know if you want to scroll up a little. So this kind of is going into it more. And I know, or at least the impression I got from our last discussion is that we weren't really necessarily thinking about retail, but how they are looking at light industrial was the idea that they have a lot of craftspeople and people who are making things and then selling what they make out of storefronts on the ground floor. So one of the shops they focused on was actually a milliner, a hat maker, as an example, but that was only one of several different options. One of the other things that I liked, and I wonder if I should have kept this document open on my own desktop, honestly.
Am I on the right one? Do you want me to go back here?
I'm actually just going to take a peek at it because one of the things that I also liked about this is that there were not a bunch of parking lots, and I'm sure there are parking lots for this around, but that they also took the approach of often using either bricks or paving stones. And I know those can be a little tricksy but I also think that they are very visually inviting because they break up a lot of those sort of flat expanses. And I know they're going to have to be parking lots, but the idea of having something that's a little physically warmer, kind of like what I think Andrew was talking about with bricks and wood. And I think visually it breaks up the eye, but it very much asks to be walked on. Yeah. That doesn't sound a little odd, but you see a brick path and you want to walk on it. You see paving stones, and it's and if you scroll down, there's a picture. Nope, not that one.
Okay, so these are actually 3 different pages on the document that on the PDF.
Yeah, there's one picture in there. I think it's still on that first page if you scroll down.
Okay.
That has a sort of a built-in bench
okay.
tree walking circle.
Oh,
There,
there we go.
Yeah, there we go.
there it is.
That I also liked. And again, this also feels very European, but it does seem like an invitation to kind of gather and sit and meet with your neighbors, and it mixes a little nature in. And I liked the artsiness of a lot of this as well. And I liked the idea that there were a lot of shop fronts devoted to craftspeople and makers. And I thought it'd be interesting to explore the idea of how we could continue to support sort of creativity and creators, not just through having public art, but would light industrials encompass that as part of its vision as well. So.
And I think it's interesting that all of the examples that you've picked out have a lot of curves in them. So there's a lot of organic quality even to the hard surfaces on the architecture. This tree is certainly, it's been around for a while and they're working really hard to keep it happy and alive. You can see that it's being propped up, but this is reminding me of William White's earth-shattering revelation that he made in the 1970s after a really elaborate research project where he found that people like to sit where there are places to sit. And it seems so simple, but they had to have a really, really large university funded project to prove it. And it turns out, yes, indeed, people do feel welcomed and invited to sit down where there are places to sit down. So we have like this truck turnaround area, and yet it's a place that you could also hang out in. So it's nice to see a space that is having to bend to the needs of vehicular circulation, but it's still making space for people. So thank you everybody for your submissions. A lot of what we're seeing today has a lot more to do with public space and open space. So we're going to revisit it as we go through our discussions over the next several weeks. For today, since we have Matt's expertise with us, we're going to start with the smaller scale items and then work our way backwards to streets and blocks on meeting number 3. So we're going to start talking about lots, and then we're going to talk about buildings and all the super fun regulatory requirements that we have to pay attention to in order to get our projects approved, and with a little bit of just design good sense that needs to be talked about as we go through it as well. So one of the scariest, hardest things to do as a designer is work with a completely blank slate. But luckily in this day and age, we very rarely actually have to do that because there are zoning requirements, watershed requirements, just general good practices that need to be followed. And then a lot of sustainability objectives that are becoming more and more the norm. So there's always a reasonable jumping off point to start with to say, what is this site going to be? So as we start thinking about lots, what is a lot? Everybody probably knows what it is, but let's flip to the next slide just to talk about it. So on the interior of the blocks, the interiors will be split up into individual lots or purchase parcels. And it's important to know that the lot lines have not yet been established throughout Hillcrest. They will be platted after the overall infrastructure package. So where the roads are going to go, where the utilities are going to go, has had a preliminary review by the city of St. Paul, and then the platting process will begin. So Monty, can you give us a little bit more information about how long that will take and what it will entail?
Well, it's interesting to note there's sort of 2 different layers of it. Fairly quickly, as the streets are established and the rights of way are established, we'll have to lock in what we would consider in land development, we would talk about them as outlots. So there will be like 1 20-acre outlot. That might be one of these light industrial lots. There might be a 5-acre outlot. That's one of these residential outlots. There's 2 components, 2 layers. It's that initial platting and then the subsequent subdivision. So the platting process establishes where the roads are going to go. These are your rights of way, right? And then next to those rights of way, there are these development areas, generally called outlots, and they will be large. and they are naturally intended for future subdivision via a lot split process or any number of technical processes to break these down into smaller sites. The Port Authority has spent 60 some years as largely a speculative land developer. So we have to invest all this money in infrastructure, cleanup, engineering, all this stuff to make these lots and sites buildable. Oftentimes, almost always, without knowing who is actually going to buy and design what building at what scale. So we try to create the largest outlots possible and then subdivide them up when we have a real building, a real owner who wants to invest and bring jobs or housing units to this neighborhood, for example. So a 20-acre outlot that looks like it's going to be light industrial, we don't know today if that is going to be 1, 2, 4, 5, 6 different buildings. And we prepare for every eventuality to make it as flexible as possible. So when a user shows up and says, hey, oh, I just realized my lease is up in 9 months. What can I do? What do you have for me? We can very quickly and flexibly respond to that with the subdivision process. So the lots are more or less established in this master planning process, which the plat will follow the master plan. And then there's the ability to chop those large outlots up into developable lots, which could be multiples of divisions within these big outlots. Does that help, Tiffany? Is that what you wanted me to go into?
That I think is perfect. And Andrew, if we could flip over to the next slide, I think it's safe to say that as we're looking at the red high density residential, orange mid density residential, and yellow low density residential, in general, the lots will be smallest in the yellow areas and get bigger as they go through orange and red. And then the really big ones are within those purple transitional industrial areas. And the transitional industrial zoning is such a special case that we're going to save it for meeting 5. So for today and for next time, we're really going to be focusing on this residential edge along the north and west side of the site and thinking about what that neighborhood node is going to be and what those major thoroughfares and corridors are going to be as they abut the residential blocks.
Can I add one thing, just since folks are seeing this maybe for the first time and getting a visual reference for what buildings could, what you've seen to date in the master plan are just the colors, not these shadows of building footprints underneath it. This is our work to try and figure out how do you serve buildings with roads based on a big blob watercolor land use map. But I can tell you right now, a few of these buildings, one of these buildings might be depicted as, let's say, 120,000 square feet. We need to know it works in the marketplace to build a 120,000 square foot building. But as I experienced when working in the North End neighborhood, that quickly became 3 40,000 square foot buildings because of the interest in the marketplace. Buildings smaller than a certain size don't make a lot of economic sense. Buildings larger than a certain size don't make a lot of economic sense. So we try to design the land to accommodate 80% of what we believe will show up in the marketplace. So just recall that, even though as we go through this exercise over the next several weeks, you'll see depictions of buildings. These are hypothetical, sort of middle of the road assumptions. When we have real buyers in the marketplace, they could carve these up 4 more times than we had anticipated, but at least we'll still be able to serve them with roads and infrastructure.
Yes. And the same is true for the buildings that you're seeing as they're represented right now in the residential areas. So this was all developed in strong collaboration with Matt Finn, who's with us today. So who has vetted all of these buildings to make sure, like, does this configuration of buildings get us to 1,000 units? You bet it does. So this is what 1,000 units could look like on the site, but it doesn't mean that's what it will look like on the site. We know that the bigger ones will be at the top and the smaller ones will be at the bottom, but it has a lot to do with long-term developer interest to see how a developer wants to invest in the site. But we
Tiffany,
do know.
Tiffany, can you just give them a sense here, because they're seeing squares on a map,
Yep.
two-dimensionally, the lowest density depicted to the highest density depicted in the housing areas?
Yeah, so in the lower left in the yellow area, we were shooting for 15 dwelling units per acre. So all those tiny little rectangles that you're looking at are duplexes, townhomes, quadplexes, sixplexes, a couple single family homes with attached garages with a potential auxiliary dwelling unit on top, and then a couple like small 12-plex apartments. And then moving north, we start to have some bigger buildings that would be approximately 3 stories tall over 1 story of parking, depending on how the grading works out for the site. Structured parking only makes sense in a lot of these buildings when you're building on a hill. So you can have the cars come in low and the people come in high. And then what we're looking at on the north edge of the site are more 6-story buildings with over 1 or 2 stories of parking. Is that right, Matt? Did I get it right? With
That's
maybe some
absolutely right.
retail
You nailed it.
along with it. Excellent, thank you.
Sometimes there's 2
So
stories
each
apart.
zoning type has already been hammered out in the master plan. So we don't really get to renegotiate that part. And each zoning type as laid out in the master plan is defined in the St. Paul zoning code. So if you guys have trouble sleeping this evening, you click on that link down there in the lower left and you guys read to your heart content. Go to section 66 and just dig right in to traditional neighborhood zoning. Let's look at the next page. What does it say in traditional neighborhood zoning? So much stuff. It's a really, really dense, incredibly text-based, evolving living document. And as not exciting as it is to read, it's really, really useful to start guiding the way that the aesthetics of this neighborhood are going to get put together. So if you do want to read it, I always recommend people to read it out loud in a British accent because it makes it more fun. And if you can get somebody to listen to you do it and interact and ask questions, extra super bonus points for you. So this is how I made it through grad school with all of my most boring classes. But in general, the traditional neighborhood districts are designed to foster the development and growth of compact, pedestrian-oriented urban villages. So that is the overall goal that we are trying to implement here. And each nuance of the traditional neighborhood district, T1, T2, and T3, have slightly different density priorities and slightly different transit and pedestrian orientation priorities in order to support that density and not only of people, but of uses. So there's a lot of information that a person can unpack here, but in general, it goes from less dense to more dense. The traditional T4 neighborhood is not going to be part of the master plan area in Hillcrest, so it's not included here, but it is an option throughout the city of St. Paul. So if we flip to the next slide, what does this all mean? Pardon my cough. I have lots of cough drops. I'm trying to keep it together. All right. So there are some very quantitative requirements spelled out in the zoning code and then a whole bunch of qualitative stuff that you kind of have to enter into a dialogue with when you go through a site plan review process. So these are some numerical requirements that just start to be pretty prescriptive as you start planning your T1 townhouse or multifamily dwelling versus a T3 6-story multifamily dwelling. Each one has a different minimum lot size because you can't have a giant building on a lot that's too small. You have to have a lot that's big enough to support the density of the building that you are proposing. You have to have certain building height restrictions depending on the type of building that you are proposing on the site. And then there are setbacks, which is really starting to get to what's happening in the yard or the lot that's not the building itself. So how far away from the front property line does the building need to land? There's a lot of flexibility, as you can see in that third column from the right, from the minimum setback to the maximum setback. So this is an area where it's worth debating whether or not at Hillcrest we want to have a more prescriptive approach to front yard, side yard, and rear yard setbacks to end up with a more consistent product. It's also worth noting that there are all these little letters on there that lead you to caveats within the code that spell out like what exactly are we expecting for our side yards, you have to go read paragraph K in order to understand what the expectation is for side yards, because it's not really a straightforward number. It just kind of depends on what's already there and what you're proposing. This is also a really good time to take a beat and talk about what floor area ratio is. So on the next slide, just in case it's not familiar to everybody, because somehow they managed to let me graduate from grad school without explaining to me what floor area ratio was, and I had to sheepishly ask somebody when I was about 1.5 years into my career, does it mean? And it was probably Matt who explained it to me. But a floor area ratio, no, I'm just kidding. We didn't work together by then. But I wish we had. So floor area ratio is how much of the building density, how dense is the building relative to the size of the lot. So if you have a 1-story building and it covers half the lot, that's a floor area ratio of 0.5, because half of it is covered in building. If you have a 2-story building, you can get away with a FAR of 0.05 on just 1/4 of the lot, because you've now stacked it up on top of each other. To have a floor area ratio of 1.0, you could cover the entire lot in a 1-story building, or you could cover half of it in a 2-story building, or 1/4 of it in a 4-story building, and so on. So when you go back to the table that we looked at on the first page, the density requirements start shifting as a measurement of dwelling units per acre, and it starts transitioning to an understanding of an FAR expectation for larger multifamily homes. So in general, you can build a multifamily home on any one of these zoning types. If you go back to the previous slide, please, for a moment, Andrea. You can see for the T1 area, you can build a multifamily home, but it's got to be up to 25 units per acre. And then once you get to T2, they're now transitioning the way that they're measuring it as a measure of floor area ratio. And it depends on whether or not you're using surface parking or structured parking. So there are so many moments in the zoning code when the answer is it depends, which is why it takes many, many months and a whole posse of trained professionals to figure out what to do. Next slide, please. All right, these are the more qualitative standards that you have to enter into a dialogue with a planner at the City of St. Paul to say, do you feel like we've fulfilled this obligation to you? Because there are no hard and fast rules. And there's a lot of overlap between what happens on the lot versus what happens on the building. So we're going to look at this slide again as we revisit all the building requirements, because some of them more apply to the yard condition and some of them more apply to the building condition. But overall, it all has to be considered as you design a site. So front yard landscaping is the 4th bullet down on the left. All front yards must be landscaped. But what does that mean? They don't really get too specific about it. They do say that hard surface front yards have to have amenities such as benches, tables, and planters, but beyond the word landscaped, they're not getting super detailed about what they're expecting to see. Maybe we want to be more detailed. The entrance location has to have a primary pedestrian entrance on all arterial or collector streets. So you can't build a building that's facing Larpenteur and then not have a door facing Larpenteur. That would be silly. So they want to make sure that that's just baked into the expectation. They're going to look for a door, and if they don't see one, they're going to make you go back and add it. So, and then screening is another big thing that has to do with how a lot is designed. If there are less than beautiful things happening on your lot, like outdoor storage, service, or loading areas, you have to screen it with a decorative element. There are a lot of other things that don't fall under those categories that you might not want to see as you drive or walk past somebody's property. So it could be that this group decides to expand the screening requirements to apply to other types of activities, or to have a more specific expectation about what that screening should be. Let's look at the next slide. So many additional requirements. We could talk about zoning for hours and not get through it. So let's just say it's really important. It's fun to read if you're having insomnia, and think about some additional requirements that apply to our sites as well. Everything within the Hillcrest site is under the jurisdiction of the Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District. So first and foremost, every single lot, no matter how big or how small, is all going to be required to capture the first 1.1 inches of runoff to be retained on site as it falls off of impervious surfacing. And that includes the roof of your building. So you can see in the image on the left why they are requiring people to capture that top 1.1 inches. It's that initial flush of rainfall where all the goop gets washed off the road and either ends up in a stormwater management facility or goes straight into a storm drain and into the nearest lake. So the goal of the watershed districts is to regulate water quality by making sure that there are little moments where the water gets stuck and cleaned before it ends up in the lake. It's a very noble goal. So you can see on this is the same example. You're just looking at the same little rain garden installation from two different angles, where it's a fun idea that's almost working, except that the rain garden installation on the lower right is undersized for the size of the parking lot that it's trying to serve. And it's also not in the right spot because most of the water is just exiting the parking lot via the driveway and not really going into the rain garden facility at all. So it's important to make sure that all of our sites leave space set aside for these stormwater management functions. And we have to make sure that it's all done in accordance with the Minnesota Stormwater Manual and that we are using best management practices at all times, which are very, very frequently updated. So you can see that's a bunch of oil and gasoline being washed off of that particular parking lot on the left-hand side. So something that any site with impervious surface needs to honor and address during their site design process. We look at the next slide. We also have to consider the long-term operations and maintenance needs of any lot as you go beyond construction completion. What's it going to take care of it? So no matter what, and no matter how many times people ask for a no maintenance landscape, there is no such thing. There's no such thing as a no maintenance building either. So no matter what you put in, it's going to get worn out. The sun, the wind, the salt, in Minnesota for sure. The salt is damaging beyond belief. And all these things need to be maintained and cared for. Even if it's something seemingly simple like a turf grass lawn, you have to send somebody out there to mow it twice a week. Some people would say, fine, we don't want to mow anymore. Let's have everybody do a native prairie installation. Those also require maintenance. The one that you're looking at on the lower right-hand side is a very, very well-maintained native prairie installation on the High Line in Manhattan. And they have an entire crew of people who have full-time jobs just going through and weeding the thing to make sure it stays in its pristine condition. On the lower left-hand side is what looks to be an incredibly natural, it just came this way landscape. That is actually a highly manicured moss garden in the Blodell Reserve in Seattle. So they have to send a similarly talented crew of gardeners to go and hand pick all the tiny little weeds that are seeking to outcompete the moss, because moss is actually not the greatest competitor insofar as the plant community goes. It's a beautiful space, but we can't be writing really, really high expectations in our covenants that become crippling when it comes to operations and maintenance considerations. So we obviously need to expect people to maintain their stuff in a nice way, but we need to have a realistic expectation of what they can actually achieve. On the next slide, this is less of a regulatory requirement and more of just a general design best practice. The philosophy being crime prevention through environmental design. So it's really thinking about how to design a landscape so people are as safe as they can possibly be, or a site. So enhancing safety through visibility, encouraging neighbor interaction, being very specific about where people belong and where people don't belong, using lighting and screening to guide people to the right spots. This is something that my 5-year-old and my 3-year-old play pretty fast and loose with. as we walk through our neighborhood, they have very little respect for what's private property and what's public realm. So whenever there's a hedge or a little bit of a fence, they start to get the clue that like, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to be in here. Maybe I should ask permission first. And that's exactly the point. So on the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little 3-minute story about this whole idea between defining the public versus the private realm. So this is a really unremarkable apartment building in Minneapolis that's special only because I used to live there. It's this really not beautiful house on a really not beautiful block right next to Sebastian Joe's, which is one of the reasons I loved it so much. And this is where I was living when I met the dude who's now my husband. And this stoop is very special to me because this is where we shared our first smooch. And it was just, it's a really important piece of urban design in my personal experience. Fast forward 2.5 years from that fateful smooch, and I'm now deep in the throes of grad school in a very Dickensian best of times, the worst of times kind of life experience. And I wake up on the first day of spring break and I'm in a good mood for the first time in like 3 months. And my soon-to-be fiance was like, she's in a good mood. Today's the day. So we go for a walk and we walk past our old apartment building and it was lovely. And he's like, let's sit down for a second. We can't. This is not our stoop anymore. That would be really uncomfortable for me. And he's like, it's no big deal. Let's just sit down. And we sat and we had a pretty hilarious fight about it for a solid 10 minutes about whether or not we were going to sit down. I finally convinced him to not sit down on the stoop itself, but on the stairs right next to the sidewalk, because that is as far as I would go. And he was just like, I just really want to sit on the stoop with you. I'm like, I can't do that. We don't live here anymore. That would be a clear violation of private property law. Not okay. I'm like, I'm not even cool with these first 3 steps here, but I'm trying to compromise with you. And it turned into a whole thing and we kind of stomped off in a huff. And then like a half hour later, he proposed to me in like a weird blurty out sort of manner on a park bench randomly on the side of the road. It was actually really romantic. But so this is the power of the stoop, that it ruined what was supposed to be this incredibly well-considered, thoughtful moment in my life. And now every single time I tell people how we got engaged, I have to tell them the story about how I ruined it. Because I have these deeply ingrained impulses about my perception of what is public and what is private that has overridden every single Hollywood inclination of like romance, and like it is more important to me in my mind, these delineations between the public, semi-private, and private space. I'm like, I will give you the first 3 stairs, but no more, sir. No more. And I still can't bring myself to sit on that stoop, even though I feel like a real bozo every single time I tell the story. So it is powerful what these cues can do to our communities to let people know where you're supposed to be. I hope you remember the story forever. Next slide, please.
Note to self, work group, conclusion, celebration, happy hour, sharing the worst proposal stories ever. I may have you beat.
It is on. Let's do it. So we've spent a huge amount of time talking about what we have to do in order to design a coherent neighborhood. So what can we really influence? So we're going to whiz through these pretty fast because we want to make sure that Matt has plenty of time to talk. So our potential areas of influence. Do we want to make the setbacks more strict? If we go to the next slide, instead of having the wiggle room of 10 to 25 feet, maybe we just say 10 feet. Maybe we just say 24 feet. Maybe we get really prescriptive about it. The nice thing about consistent setbacks is you have a very clear circulation route and this really, really coherent geometry to the site, but you don't necessarily have tiny little pockets for planting and sitting and chilling out. So there's a give and a take there that needs to be considered. On the next slide, we can talk about yards, especially the front yard. Side yards and rear yards are important too, but the front yard is really the face of these residential zones and how they present to the community. So they're setting the overall tone for the neighborhood aesthetic. And there are no right answers. but there are more desirable solutions and less desirable solutions depending on what your final aim is. So if your goal is to create a pedestrian-oriented neighborhood, which I think it is because that's what it says we have to do in the master plan, we need to think about the pedestrian experience as you're coming in and out of these buildings and as you're walking past these buildings. So you can see in the upper left, we have these teeny tiny front yards, but they all are they're all preloaded with front porches and this very like, hey, how you doing moment every single time you walk by somebody's house. The one on the right is a little bit more spacious, but it's still a place where you could wander by and say, hey, how are you, to a total stranger who's just chilling in their front yard drinking a lemonade. And that can be fun. The one on the lower left doesn't really have an opportunity for people to sit down. It is more of a passing through space only where you approach, you go in, and that's kind of it. And then on the lower right, is that even really a place for people at all, or are these front yards 100% designed to cater toward vehicles? I would propose it's all about cars on that lower right-hand one. On the next slide, the world is our burrito when it comes to what we could ask the Hillcrest development to become insofar as its ecological value and potential. There are 40 million acres of turf grass in the lower 48 states already. Do we need to give them any more? It's the largest single irrigated crop in the country, and it offers next to no ecological value at all. It even is considered as an impervious surface, depending on who you ask who's doing their stormwater calculations, because water doesn't soak into it nearly as effectively as a native planting. So do we want to make sure that when we say landscaped front yard, they don't just mean turf grass, that it means something different? And what do we think about tree requirements? There are tree requirements in the city of St. Paul. Do we want there to be more? Do we want to really focus on habitat establishment? These are all things that are worth discussing and considering further on down the line as we get into the shredding process. And then the next one, parking. So there are a lot of implications here to explore. Cost implications, first of all, for structured versus surface parking. Structured parking is crazy expensive compared to surface parking, but surface parking takes up space. And now that the city of St. Paul no longer has parking minimum requirements, it's kind of it's hard to anticipate how a lot of developers are going to respond to this requirement. So without further ado, let's talk about buildings, because I know Matt has years worth of experience dealing with a lot of these issues that we just discussed. He has the most experience of all of our team members compiled here going through the site plan review process. So that's the negotiation process that I mentioned previously of saying, I think I did what you asked me to do. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page. So,
can I just interject for us just once again to take a couple of minutes, because I think that was a lot of really good information, but I want to make sure that and before we segment into another section, that we give our guests the opportunity. Do you have any observations that you'd like to share from seeing this, or any questions that you might have as it relates to what you've seen now or some of the requirements? So where we have influence and where we don't have influence.
I have a quick question about the can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
The stormwater management system. For that, is it require that the owner installs like an underground tank type of thing, or is it just using those bioswale things?
It is something that the owner is has the discretion to decide how they want to deal with it. So if the owner wants to do something on the surface, it takes up space, but it's usually more straightforward and cheaper. If the owner wants to spend the money to do a subsurface stormwater installation, that's their prerogative, but they need to prove that they are treating all the water according to those watershed standards, and that they're respecting all of the other requirements for density development.
You know, Tiffany, if I could add to that, the master plan talks about the preferred stormwater concept here being a district or a regionally based system, meaning that we are trying to do some cooperative, efficient use of resources to manage public and private stormwater. public stormwater off the street, private stormwater off the development parcels. So generally, a land buyer can go to the city and propose whatever their solution might be, on-site, underground, at grade, whatever, a big pond, a deep pond, a dry pond, etc. We intend to be far more specific than that in this case. And that is a whole discussion with numerous regulatory agencies, the Watershed District, the Public Works Department, the Storm Sewers Department, important for this group to understand. I think the royal we on the Port Authority team would love to see highly amenitized stormwater features that help to buffer land uses within the right-of-way, meaning maybe more extensive setbacks than typical in a normal Port Authority business center to give us extra width, extra room to insist upon, frankly, require shared stormwater management. We know what it looks like because we've done it for 50 years to make each owner build what they want to build to meet their permit requirement on their site. We have learned over that same course of time that there are far more environmentally effective and cost-effective ways if we share stormwater management and resources and view stormwater as a resource, not as a waste product. We anticipate there being, and we're getting in the weeds, but that's where we're going to wind up. We anticipate there being, the city has a new green infrastructure district. They can create, one was used at Allianz Field for the entire super block at Snelling University. One is being used at Ford. It's a way to permit and establish and construct an entire area's stormwater management and also charge back to those future building owners. So if I tell you you don't have to build a big, deep, wet, expensive stormwater pond or put big, deep, expensive pipes under your parking lot because you can connect to this utility that's already been established for you that manages stormwater in a sustainable way, you generally are willing to pay an initial hookup charge and an ongoing maintenance fee for that through an ordinance process that now legally you can be assessed like they were plowing your street or like for your street lights, etc. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. We haven't figured it out yet, but for this group to think about, if stormwater is being managed at the surface that can be visible to the public, either on public property or private property, we don't know yet. Does it look wild? Does it look like you would see in, I don't know, Colorado? Does it look highly designed and hardscaped like you might see in a much more dense urban area? Those are the things we have yet to figure out, and we would love to hear and see your guys' ideas about what this shared stormwater district would look like. I do not anticipate this being a lot by lot, everybody has their own pond and they all look the same and they all serve the same ecological function. We are striving for a higher level of stormwater amenitization and sustainable performance.
Thank you. And actually on the next slide, I forgot I have one of the examples that Serenity submitted. There is in the foreground a stormwater condition right there in the boulevard where this neighborhood that she found in Tempe, Arizona, where they just don't have cars in the neighborhood at all. There's no like secret parking garage off on the side. They just are not having a car-based neighborhood existence. There's this whole perimeter of stormwater installation along the edge of it that is starting to help address what they have for their stormwater needs in Arizona, which is very different than the condition that we are dealing with here. But it's a really, really interesting and unique idea. And can we push it this far in Hillcrest, or is there a middle ground that we can consider? So Matt, why don't you take it away and start telling us about all the fun things that it takes to make a building?
Sure, happy to start. Are there any other questions before I start? I know, Andrew, you gave an opportunity for a little bit. Other than Frankie, anybody else have a question about lots before I dive in? Or should we save some time? Better to save some time at the end? All right.
We have till 8, yes.
Okay. So when we start thinking about buildings and start thinking about buildings specifically at Hillcrest, there are a few things to start with. First, there are several codes and requirements unique to buildings beyond what Tiffany introduced for lots that already help us understand the forms and the functions of the buildings within the overall site. Second, there are different areas of the site that require different types of buildings. So we talked about the different lots. There are also different types of buildings within each of those zoning classifications. And then there are several other things that parts of buildings that this group can inform, some that are prescribed or guided already, and some that we'll have more influence over. So as we move through the next couple of slides, we're going to start with that same site plan image that we talked about at the beginning, with the similar caveats that the building configuration is a draft. It's an approach that we took as a way, as Tiffany noted, to vet the number of units and the density of the overall site. And as we've already talked about, it starts from the north and the darker red as 5- and 6-story buildings. And as you move to the south, they become 3- and 4-story buildings in the orange. And then they go to 1- and 2-story buildings at lower densities as you get to the south and to the west. There are a couple of comments earlier about accessory dwelling units that are possible, but the majority of what's here is detached housing in the lower left, all the way up to mixed use 5- and 6-story buildings in the upper right. And interestingly, the guiding parts of the zoning code treat those different sizes of buildings differently. So as this group considers how they might write covenants, the covenants may adapt, just like the zoning code does, from lower density to higher density buildings. And again, the industrial buildings might be treated differently still to sort of mirror how the other codes and regulations treat the built environment. So as we keep going on to the next slide, there are a few of these guiding documents. They include the City of St. Paul zoning code, which are the traditional neighborhood districts that were introduced earlier. They guide not just the lots and the setbacks and some other things, but they also guide the design of the buildings through things like height and a few other things we're going to talk about in a minute or two. The state of Minnesota has a building code. The building code is largely focused on minimum standards. It ensures safe construction, things like fire ratings and types of construction, whether it's wood or concrete or steel. All of those are referenced in the building code. It also addresses things like how you design buildings for schools and what's different between a school and a residential building and an industrial building. All of that's baked into the building code. The uses sometimes are also addressed in the zoning code. And then lastly, the building code also makes reference to other codes and standards that apply to buildings, like the energy code, the accessibility code, plumbing, mechanical, etc. There are before you go.
Sorry.
Back one. in between, Andrea. You gotta go ahead one.
Now go. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, there's one in between. Is there one in between?
There's one in between.
There's
there
one.
we go, that one.
Number 24.
I think it's lagging behind your clicking, Andrea.
Oh, so number 24. Okay, I'm going to leave it because I'm at 24.
Yep. Okay. Super. So there are some other things that are that also cover the sort of building part of the built environment. So there are sustainability requirements, the things that this group was introduced to last time I understand. The LEED certification for neighborhoods will bring its own set of standards to the built environment, which will include, to my understanding, regulations around how insulated the buildings are, what types of mechanical systems they use, how the roofs are used for PV. And a lot of that sustainability requirement work, at least as it relates to buildings, will be coming out of the sustainability work group, not necessarily out of this group. And then I think Tiffany did a nice job of talking about operations and maintenance of the landscape. And I think we could have a similar conversation about operations and maintenance for buildings. So there are some things that are like turf grass, like painted siding, for instance. It's a relatively low cost material at the beginning, but wow, do you get to maintain it over the life of a project? It's very normal, very typical, but it comes with a set of basically a financial commitment to maintain that in a very specific way. Andrew talked about his affinity for brick, and I think that's shared by a lot of people, me included. Brick has its own relationship between first cost and ongoing maintenance costs, including the images we saw in Europe. Things like stone have an even higher first cost, but maybe an even smaller life cycle cost. The other thing that we also sometimes talk about is, or we're talking about more, is the embodied energy that's used to create each of these materials and maintain each of these materials. And that is a conversation that's much farther into the weeds than we necessarily need to get to today. But we'll touch on it a little bit as we get further into a conversation on materials. So now we can go to slide 25.
And sorry, I have a very touchy screen. I just test my mouse and it moves to another slide.
It's totally okay, Andrew. So this is a repeat of the slide we saw earlier. And what is shown here, what's highlighted here, are the things that are more applied to buildings. So you'll note that you see things like one-family dwellings in each of the T1, T2, and T3, which means they're allowed by zoning, but I think this group might want to prescribe that certain building types are allowed in certain zoning classifications to get the entire project to the number of dwelling units that is desired. Tiffany also introduced this idea of floor area ratio, and you see it show up with the bigger buildings. So multifamily buildings, often we use FAR, and sometimes there are tables that follow this. I mean, the zoning code is thousands of words and I don't know, hundreds of pages long. So this is one table. And you see that comment in multifamily at FAR as listed for mixed use. So there are lots of cross references that take place in here to understand how big buildings are. And Frankie, your question about stormwater. So this concern about floor area ratio means that if you have a smaller footprint of a building, you have more site available to do things like treat stormwater on site. So if you allow a higher floor area ratio, you're allowed more land to do other things with the land, whether that's meet other sustainability requirements or treat stormwater or provide for parking. So all of these requirements start to overlap on top of one another, and they're very related, and they relate not just to the zoning code, but to the other goals of the whole project site. The other little black box here that says there are other heights that are allowed. So you'll see in T3, a 55-foot tall building is allowed, but there's additional information about height further down in the tables. These are the sorts of things that as a project architect we get to deal with quite frequently. And they're complicated, but they're worth understanding for this group. And lastly, I would say that the front yard setback, the traditional neighborhood districts in St. Paul are somewhat unique in that they have both a minimum and a maximum, which is somewhat unusual. Most zoning codes have a minimum, but not a max. And then the way the traditional neighborhood district is enforced, or the way that the city staff review the proposals, they have a certain amount of latitude in infill projects to help projects determine where they should sit in between that minimum and maximum. For Hillcrest, the use of the traditional neighborhood district and these minimum maximum setbacks might need to be tuned up in order to meet other project goals, whether it's trees in front yards or holding a consistent street edge. So let's keep going on to the next slide. So the traditional neighborhood district, so what's highlighted here are the things that apply to buildings, like building facade continuity. So in a historic commercial district that has storefronts on the street, traditional neighborhood district says you have to maintain that street wall because it's weird if they step back. So again, city staff have a role in helping projects meet those requirements in a qualitative way, not just a quantitative way. Buildings are encouraged to be 2 stories tall. This is the area where we're encouraged to have porches and stoops. And again, they're not necessarily quantitatively set. Like no one says the stoop has to be 20 feet wide. They say you have to have a stoop. And then as a design professional, we have to engage, or not we have to, we get to engage with city staff and with our clients to make sure that the intent of the zoning code is being met, and then the intent of the program and the project is being met as well. As we keep moving, materials and details, we'll talk about this a bit more. We can take a look at it here. Different classes of materials apply to different facades. One of the materials we talk about some is glass. So material glass is both a material and it's used to consider percentage of opening or percentage of transparency. Buildings get articulated in different ways. The facades are changed. We have bays, we have awnings, we have cornices, we have canopies. All of these things are included in the zoning code and then are affected by what, or could be affected by what this group wants to talk about or wants to see. And as we keep going, we're gonna click through each of these different categories. So go back up one.
Sorry, I'm literally, I touched
That's okay. It's okay, Andrew.
and it moves.
So we organized form and scale into we broke it into two pieces. The first slide here is about bigger buildings. So in the upper left, you see a building with a setback. So and then below it, a 5-story building that has a really tall hat or a tall cornice. So Tiffany made mention of architecture school. I've spent some time, I was in architecture school, but I've also taught at the university for a number of years. And we spent a lot of time talking about how buildings meet the sky and how they meet the ground. So there are a few different examples here on the screen, and we'll start, if you think about that, just sort of how the buildings meet the sky and how they meet the ground. There are different types of architecture, different sort of styles of architecture that recall different eras of construction. And they treat this relationship between how a building meets the sky and how it meets the ground a little bit differently. And those get reinforced in the zoning code when we talk about how buildings are articulated. Sometimes we require setbacks, and they do have a pretty specific impact on the built environment and how pedestrians move around that built environment. So if we go to the next scale down, so that we have a group of smaller scale buildings. So similar set of questions about roof lines, how the buildings meet the sky, how they meet the ground. We have lots of conversations about how each of these buildings creates entry, whether it's individual entries for individual dwelling units or whether those entries are shared between multiple units. And then the other thing I wanted to point out here was that density can vary pretty widely from attached units in a sample like a townhome or in detached units like a single family home, but they tend to be at the lower end of the density scale. So these are the sorts of things you would see in the south and west end of the site. And the size and shape of them is roughly in this category. How they're articulated, how they're detailed, how they're made will likely differ based on which developers ultimately are involved. We can keep going to the next slide. To extend this conversation around entry, there's one example in St. Paul, is one of my favorite buildings over by the Xcel Energy Center. It's a historic row house example where there are entries on the first, sort of up on the first floor with stoops, and I believe there are some entrances below. It's kind of south and west of the Science Museum, on Exchange, if you ever wanted to go see that. And then you see a building in the lower portion, which I think is in Minneapolis, which just has a single entrance. And interestingly, buildings with a single entrance, they do some things that could be considered positive. They preserve some open space in the front for landscape or biodiversity or gathering. While multiple entrances offer opportunities for personalization, which is desirable for really everybody. They add some human scaled features. We don't know if Tiffany would have been comfortable standing on any of those stoops or not. We could ask her later. And then entries are also subject to lots of different requirements on location. We know that sometimes they're required to be headed toward corners. They have various requirements around articulation, on quantity, and in some cases on materiality too. So we spent a lot of time talking about entrances, particularly in the traditional neighborhood districts. We go to the next slide, Andrea. Unfortunately, Andrew had to move on to another meeting tonight, but these are a couple of slides that he shared. Including an example that has a weathered or weathering wood material oriented vertically, and then a brick building. So the city zoning already classifies materials into different groups. More durable materials get grouped together, things like masonry, metal, and glass. There's an intermediate category, usually around fiber cement, wood, and phenolic materials, which is really usually like resin and craft paper. Turned into siding. And then there are less desirable, less durable materials, which include things like vinyl. And then we also know that not only do we consider the durability of those materials and their associations, but we have to figure out sort of what they mean to a project or what they mean to a neighborhood. So Andrew, when he started today, talked about brick being warm and having a hand scale or texture. There are certainly materials that occur more commonly in individual regions. So the Twin Cities sees a lot of, historically saw a lot of siding and stucco because of the way it weathered in our environment. So that local relatability and sort of local context is a part of what makes materials feel like they fit. I made a mention earlier about embodied energy. That is part of the conversation here. Can you go back just for a second, Andrew? One more. What was the last thing? Oh, different facades. So the zoning code also says the primary facades facing out towards streets and the public usually are treated differently than the elevations that are oriented sort of more to the side or to the back. That was a more minor point. We can keep going. The next slide on transparency. So we see two extremes here. One with a building that is almost all windows and one that is far less. So anytime we talk about transparency, the percentage of transparency or the percentage of window opening that's prescribed in the code, or in this case, as could be amended in covenants, there's a balance between how we understand the relationship between in and out, energy performance, because windows generally perform less well than walls, and then relationships to neighbors and neighborhoods. Some of the slides that Tiffany showed in around the yards and lots had a lot of openings facing out onto the yards. And in some cases, the buildings that had deep yards a long ways from the street, there's less incentive to have bigger openings because you're farther away from the built environment, farther away from people. Typically, the zoning requires a certain percentage of opening facing to public streets. That's part of that material change. Not only does it apply to durability of materials, it also applies to percentage of opening. And then, curiously, the zoning code currently allows for tinted and reflective glass in certain uses, and some of those include industrial uses. So as you sort of store this little nugget away for later, but some uses are allowed to have glazing that is even opaque, which is strange, but it is allowed by the zoning code. So if that's something that seems foreign or unusual, it's not allowed in residential buildings, but in certain types it is allowed by the zoning code. So if that doesn't seem like something you'd like to see, there are mechanisms that this group could consider to adapt or adjust that. On to the next slide. If two extremes here on articulation. One that's very flat, very planar, and one that tries very hard to break down the scale of a building from sort of whole scale of a street frontage down to the scale of a person and ultimately down to the scale of your hand. So those types of articulation that are encouraged in the code now include things like entry canopies, projected windows or bays, awnings, balconies, railings, cornices or parapets, the way that building meets the sky. So if you were to take that sort of way of understanding the built environment and say, what are the things that go into meeting the sky? What are the things going to meeting the ground? Cornices and parapets are part of that sky conversation, and balconies, railings, windowsills, all those things are about how we get articulate buildings down closer to the ground. And there's a huge spread between how inviting the building on the upper left looks from how the building on the lower left looks, and how that creates a neighborhood and encourages people to be out in that neighborhood as they walk around. We can move to the next one, I think. This is an image. I understand that was it Frankie that showed this one of the project on Young on University Avenue, and it got our group thinking about how buildings can be encouraged to convey their use, and sometimes that information can be shared through entry type or frequency. Sort of, if it's a building that has ground floor units, if that building is encouraged to have those units front the street or have a door facing the street. Sometimes it's through signage or public art. Sometimes it's through the materiality or the selection of materials. And we've seen some examples today that conveyed their use or their function by being really clear about what outdoor spaces and amenities they provide. So to hear Monty talk about a highly amenitized stormwater structure, that really conveys the values and the uses in a neighborhood. And I think that can be really great. And if the buildings can do that too, as well as the landscape. And I think we have one last slide on buildings. Nope, that was it. They were slightly different. I think I tried them in a slightly different order. So, Andrew, did we get to the same thing we did before with questions from the group?
Yeah. So, yep. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
So you can see everyone. And then just before we go into the homework for the next session, really finding out if people have any observations or questions on on the direction of what you're seeing and what we can influence. Any of the examples that people liked more than others?
Yeah, definitely. There were some where I'm like, that is a chilly, unfriendly looking building. And I wish strongly that we do not have a bunch of chilly, unfriendly looking buildings.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I would say that the City of St. Paul and the zoning code is really trying to avoid chilly and friendly buildings. So it's there's a lot of tools in those traditional neighborhood districts that are geared toward doing that. So have you ever, how many of the group have seen that document before or heard about it before? Was that totally new?
Mhm.
Yes, Jess, we know you've seen it. Was it new for you, Jennifer?
Yes. I mean, I assume something of the sort existed, but a lot of these seemed like here's something interesting and here's something we really don't want to do. And I know, granted, that may have been my own taste coming to the fore at a couple of points, but and I feel, given how long winters are here, and I'm not a native Minnesotan, I will admit that freely, I feel like having the warmth of more organic looking buildings or natural materials becomes even more important because things get so chilly visually as well as actually. Um, but what my question originally was going to be, honestly, is there a checklist that we're going to be working off of? Because I was scribbling notes frantically throughout all of this, and I'm like, okay, if I can read half of these by the time I'm done, it's going to be a miracle. But you know, are there going to be sort of prompts for like, hey, don't forget stormwater. Hey, don't forget, you know, I assume that we're going to have something like that to work off of as we continue for the next few months.
It's more, what are you guys interested in exploring further and where your priorities lie? So if that's a priority that you want to dig into, by meeting 4, we're going to start hopefully meeting in person and having a design charrette to say, you know, we've all been trying to get up to speed on all of the design and regulatory vernacular that we need to have at our disposal to make sure we're not violating any major rules. And then bearing all that in mind, these are the ideas that I would love to see. I want to see warm, friendly buildings, and I won't rest until we have it written in the covenants that all buildings shall be warm and friendly.
Yeah,
And
ride or
how
die
are
for
we going to
friendliness.
define
Okay.
that? You know, so maybe that's what it says, is warm and friendly, and then it's part of the qualitative assessment process that is underway. It's kind of, the Port Authority has its own review process when they review for covenants. That's very similar to the site plan review that the City of St. Paul does. So it's really just requirements above and beyond what the city would ask to see. So if warm and friendly ends up being in the covenants, then that's what we will assess it on as we get these submissions. I mean, like, not friendly enough, send it back.
Okay, and I understand that that is a ridiculously subjective bit of phrasing on my part. I
It's
do
not at all.
recognize that.
It's really not. And I think that those subjective phrases are some of the most valuable when it comes to describing the essence and the character of an urban space, because a lot of them can't be quantified and you have to rely on qualitative factors in order to make sure you're communicating correctly.
Okay, but what I'm hearing is that we're going to be looking for sort of goals of what we want to prioritize and aesthetics and how we want
Yes.
this thing to come into shape. And then we're going to look for ways to sort of thread the needle and find what kind of language in the covenants would support those overall goals.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So does the language already exist in the zoning or building codes? If so, cool. Do we want to make it a little bit more stringent? Then let's talk about how. And if it's something that nobody's ever thought of before, we should definitely talk about it here.
Okay. Cool.
And, you know, maybe it would make sense after this meeting, as well as after the next meeting, to do, I'll send out a survey so that you can kind of share your input. Like right now, today, this is what I really want to focus on. And maybe after the meeting next week, you might have some different ideas, but then we can continue to collect that information. And then the minutes will be available. So those should be on our website, either if not tomorrow, then on Monday. And so that you can go back and look at that information. And again, if more questions come up out of there, I'll have this survey link so you can go back as frequently as you want to input information.
That sounds like a great idea. That because ideally is an ever evolving list of things, the more we talk and the more we iterate. So next time on meeting 3, we're going to be taking a step back in scale and looking at the blocks and the streets. So the blocks are really configured based on how the right of way has been laid out in the master plan and how that affects overall circulation patterns, and then the zoning issues that we've already started touching on with the different zoning designations, and then what's happening in the streets themselves. So that's not a private property issue, that's a public right of way issue. And what is the streetscape character and how should those streetscapes be interacting with the private realm and the public realm that there will be throughout the site, because there will be a 5-ish acre city park in the middle of Hillcrest up on the northern end by the neighborhood node, and there will be 15 acres of passive open space that have to be open to the public. So are we walking through them on trails? Are we walking through them on boardwalks? Now, it's important to remember that there will be an additional work group to specifically focus on the look and character of those open spaces, the passive open space specifically, and the trail character of the right of way. So that's a really, really targeted discussion about the design and the priorities of those open spaces. But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it here, because urban design really is like this very holistic umbrella that can go off on a whole bunch of different tangents, and they're all really, really valuable, and they're all deeply interconnected. So just because that's not the topic of conversation doesn't mean we shouldn't explore it.
And I'm going to just add on that a little bit. So as we're talking about this, our community engagement from the Port Authority's perspective, this is an ongoing process. So we really kind of hit the streets and got a baseline of information, which we've shared with you, and they've sort of guided some of our discussions. But now as you are in these work groups, I would say that anything that you said that you want to have influence or make sure gets carried over to that public space group. So we'll be capturing that information, and we can use that as part of the introduction to that group. So you all have the opportunity to apply for that group, but at the same time, we can share information. And then one of the things that we can do throughout this process before we actually end is if you as a group think there's certain things that you'd like to know more about what your neighbors think. So let's say you decide that, I don't know what they would be, but you think that these setbacks, this is what you think is important, and here's different ideas that maybe people are, we have some people like this or that. If there's anything that anyone can see, it would be helpful to have neighborhood surveys done again through boosted social media. We can do that. And we've actually gotten some pretty good responses. And so if you think of something that you want additional neighborhood feedback, please let me know. And that's something we can easily turn around. Because what we've been doing is targeting within 1 mile of the actual golf course, which I think some of you found out about the work group through that social media campaign. So we get very targeted.
Is there anything else coming to the forefront of people's minds as things that you want to start drawing, things that you want to start looking up pictures for, or questions that you're hoping to have answered in our next couple meetings?
I think one of the things that I feel, being that the neighborhoods around here are so much older, and bringing into a very new development, the concept of how it's all going to blend in and not just be stuck in the middle of the old neighborhoods, if that makes sense.
Very much, yes. So that's one of the main reasons why that entire western edge is planned to be residential, because that was feedback that the city of St. Paul and the Port Authority have been hearing for the past 2 years. I'm going to give everybody a heads up. I hear 2 children coming my way, and they're pretty tired and they're very loud. So, but that transition zone from the existing neighborhood into what's happening in Hillcrest, part of the reason why it's going to be a residential buffer along that edge is to make sure that it's not a dramatic change, and that we end up having a gradual shift from the existing neighborhood into that which will come after redevelopment happens. Can I call on Donna or Frankie to share your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, so as far as the like design and of, is this group focused on like how much are we influencing the buildings, pretty much is what I'm trying to get at. Are
Great.
we focusing on every single building type, or is it just, are we as a group trying to focus on just residential or just the commercial parts, or just the open space and stuff like that?
I like to imagine it as like the guts of the building are not really something that we're worried about here, but we're worried about the parts of the building that you can see as you're standing on the sidewalk. So, and that relationship that the building is necessarily going to have with the public realm and the people walking past it. Even if they aren't supposed to be at that building, they're just passing through, walking their dog, it's still affecting their day-to-day experience of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So,
You know, Frankie, I would say, I think this is where Matt was going, was we have talked primarily about some housing focused building components today. In the next meeting or two, we'll talk about some of the commercial, what I'm more familiar with, the light industrial buildings. But certainly the design of the buildings themselves. I mean, if you imagine the difference between a 4-story multifamily building made out of modern materials with a contemporary design and amenities and balconies and a dog park and a community garden in the front yard, versus a completely different approach to design, which may speak more to a pitched roof, suburban, duplex, triplex, quadplex sort of approach. I mean, that is the breadth of influence of this group, because at this point, the land use has been determined. The developers, the design aesthetic, the style they will bring to these projects has certainly not been determined, but it certainly will be influenced by this group. You know, we are an urban city that's building density. My personal feeling as a member of this group, not facilitating, but as staff, certainly with a voice as the property owner, is that this site and these units reflect an active urban character. We are, you know, not necessarily building in the suburbs. We might be a very short way from the suburbs, but we're still in the city of St. Paul, where we are adding density and adding vitality through that density. You know, we need to also be recognizing and designing product of all real estate types that speaks to those in the future that are going to wind up here over the next 10 years, which is a very different aesthetic, very different buying and decision-making and location-making process than we've had for the last several decades or several generations. We need to be designing and building a community that works into the future while respecting the past. So that is that balance that we are trying to find with your help.
And Frankie, I would say we just grabbed a snippet of the traditional neighborhood zoning, and it is a little bit sleepy in places. But if you haven't ever looked at it or looked at that reference, I'd encourage you to go read it or read more of it, because the pieces that we highlighted today are really geared toward doing what Monty was talking about, which is making the neighborhood work for the residents that are around it, and the qualitative things, not necessarily the quantitative, because those are a little hard to wrap your brain around, but the qualitative things are really tuned toward, I mean, this whole idea, the name of it as a traditional neighborhood district. Most cities don't have this zoning classification. St. Paul's pretty unique in that way. And it is really about maintaining the quality of the neighborhood. So it's worth giving that section a read.
Donna, has anything come up while you've been listening in on the presentation that you would like to explore in future discussions? It could be that we have lost Donna. And that's okay. So Yeah, there's a lot that's already been figured out. So sometimes it can feel like, what else we gonna do? Oh, hey Donna, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I had it unmuted, but I didn't.
No problem.
Okay,
Okay.
no, I was gonna ask a question about the industrial sections. That's, I think, the biggest concern that a lot of my neighbors have. And also the density, the high density types. And I remember seeing that there was gonna be all types of housing. I see that there are some, those are some single family dwellings involved, okay. But the high density is gonna be closest to my neighborhood, which will be of concern. I just kind of I kind of see why it was developed that way. Because when you're driving past on McKnight, you've got some businesses on that corner, and maybe that's why, went that direction for less single family on that side versus the Wiper Avenue side. And I guess my biggest concerns are traffic, given the industrial, and traffic given the high density. And I think that's a lot. I'm speaking for a lot of my neighbors when I say that. But what do you envision to be the industrial type of buildings that is there interest, I guess? And I don't know if you're even at that point yet, or if anybody is, but just kind of just wondering what you're envisioning there.
Sure.
Is there, at the next meeting, is it possible to share some of the renderings that are pending, to at least say these are thoughts and here's the direction, and get people's feedback on what they think? Because I do know that through the community engagement process, we heard over and over about making sure that this didn't look like every other industrial business park that the Port Authority has done. And so Tiffany can go into more detail, but they have put some thought process around making this a more of a neighborhood asset than what you would see in a traditional business center. And I think that, I don't know exactly what the plan is on how to engage this group with those concepts, but I'm going to stop talking now, but I do know that that's been a conversation already.
I think that's a great idea. We were gonna wait until meeting 5, so we had like plenty of time to like really drill into these residential spaces. But we're hearing, it's obvious that there's a great deal of interest and concern about what's happening in these light industrial spaces. So we already have a lot of information that we can share. So for meeting 3, we can rearrange what the agenda was going to be a little bit, probably shorten up what we were going to talk about regarding blocks. And then we can incorporate a stronger discussion about what we are envisioning for this arts and employment district. So the general concept being that the average light industrial building is not super cool to look at. And so how can we make it a visual amenity? And how can we enhance the lots themselves to become community amenities as well? So it's not just a light industrial space. It becomes a beautiful corridor past which you can walk your dog, you can go for a bike ride, you can go for your morning run. It's a place where you actually want to walk to work, where you want to bike to work. So when people start getting concerned about increased traffic loads, we're doing everything in our power to encourage people to do anything but drive a car. So how about we definitely make plans to talk about that 2 weeks from now? We made some nice pictures.
Donna, I can add, you mentioned location and density of the housing. The master plan really determined the location of the land uses, the density of the land uses. It of course makes sense to put the higher density land uses up towards the higher vehicular traffic roadways. Very common throughout our urban areas, much so as here, getting people in and out of this area efficiently without clogging up neighborhood roads, residential single-family roads, because they can pull out and get right on Lexington or Larpenteur, or McKnight, and get to the freeway system. The industrial spaces, We do have a ton of interest. Frankly, other than multifamily construction, industrial is really the hottest real estate sector in the country, if not the world right now. Even though many of us stopped going to retail and hospitality and many of these other types of buildings, all the stuff we've all been ordering off of Amazon during COVID for the last 2 years still has to be manufactured. It still has to be packaged, distributed, assembled, repaired, and that takes these light industrial businesses. If you drive up and down Phelan Boulevard across the east side, you'll see the last 30 years of light industrial construction and development, starting earlier in the late 90s at the Williams Hill Business Center, right up by 35E and Phelan Boulevard, Cayuga, the 35E and Cayuga interchange. One of those old low-rise industrial buildings we built 30 years ago was torn down and turned into that multi-story brain surgery center for Health Partners. So that's the glacial pace of economic development and land development. We turned that contaminated site into a light industrial business center, and now it's a hub for health and medical uses. You drive a little further east to Westminster Junction, you'll see a mix of land uses, really all up and down Phelan Boulevard. We've brought 2,000 jobs back to the east side of St. Paul along Phelan Boulevard, which was formerly a contaminated railroad corridor full of train cars, full of rotting phone books, and semi-truck trailers full of tires and that kind of stuff. That's where we've come from. This is the most eastern extension of that thinking, of that idea that we can take this contaminated, unproductive land and put it back into realistic land use that makes our communities more livable with jobs, housing, tax base, parks, open space, etc. If you take that tour down Phelan Boulevard, you'll see these light industrial buildings. We would call them generally office warehouse buildings, light industrial buildings. They are from generally 40 to 80,000 square feet. The bigger ones, Baldinger Bakery, Vomella, right on Phelan Boulevard, house hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of living wage jobs with no barriers to entry. At our heart, we're an economic development organization. We bought this site in partnership with the city to make it an opportunity site for jobs and housing and tax base. The designs you'll see, we've set that large picture platform for the goals of the site. You all are helping us detail what does it look like? What does it feel like when you walk past it? And that's really the point we're at today.
Yeah, so it seems like hopefully what you'll see in the designs is that we heard the community say that we need to do better from how it looks and how it interacts with the neighborhood because it is in a unique location. And so I think it'll help to see those images and start talking through that thought process.
We've spent the last 60 years, Donna, trying to build better, dumb, ugly boxes on the industrial side. And we think we've gotten better at it generation after generation, decade after decade. This will be our highest lift yet. If we can really get this community-focused art and these murals covering these large buildings, it will be something that you really only see in historic communities around the world and not really in new development. So we're pretty excited about it, and we'll be sharing that stuff with you very shortly.
And will there be conversations with this group about some of the landscaping that may be done as far in terms of the buffers? Because I think being part of the surveys and things, I know that there's really conversations, people wanting to know what those buffers are going to look like. So that's what would really, I think, make this different from the Phelan corridor is the buffering system.
Yes, absolutely. We
Much
can
more-
discuss that in tandem with the Arts and Employment District concept.
And just to tie that back to the lot discussion we had today, Andrea, those buffers would be totally determined by the setbacks we're talking about and how those apply to our lots. And I just wanted to add, Donna, to one more thing about the high density residential and a layer of regulatory control we didn't even talk about is the comprehensive plan, which had its own community engagement process and really outlined the need for a master plan in this area in the first place and identified the Hillcrest site as a spot for a neighborhood node. So all of this is driven by what that community led process identified.
And it's also reflecting what's found in the Maplewood comp plan. That's also identifying the intersection of Larpenteur and McKnight as a node for future densification.
Yeah, I
If you guys
suppose that.
needed more documents to go read in your free time.
But hopefully some of the green spaces that people don't have access to now, unless they were golfing, will bring, they'll bring value and being able to have some of those conversations.
Yeah, we got to remember, this was a private country club, frankly, for 100 years. This was not publicly accessible green space. Yes, one of our colleagues' family grew up a block to the west of here, and they would sneak on the course and sled, and they would sneak on the course, and they would get chased off the course by security. It wasn't public space. It wasn't publicly accessible green space. It wasn't park space. It was privately owned country club for decades. So we are definitely doing our part to return some public access for housing, for jobs, for recreation that really had not been seen in 2 generations.
Yeah, and a lot of trails. Trails seem to be a big part of the plan.
Well, I'm liking that part.
Wait till you see the cool pictures. We're tweaking up these renderings, but you guys will see some cool pictures. Again, not to tell you anything has already been determined, but to show you the quality and the level of what we believe is possible with your guidance.
Great. And we can share anything that you've shared with us, correct?
Sure.
Okay. Good.
We're a public agency. We're open book.
Okay, that sounds good. I had trouble with the camera today because I didn't have the app, I guess, and I switched to my Mac. So I apologize. I'm not trying to hide from you.
It's 8 o'clock. You're loud.
Yeah, I think it's time to quit.
Thank you all.
Oh, was there
This has
homework?
been great. Thank you, guys.
Was there homework?
Yes, Donna, we just
Oh,
had
homework.
suggested that we gather some more places now that you have a little more to base those searches on that might have come to you while we talked about this today of what you'd like to see on this site moving forward. So elaborating on what you already sent or sending some new spots that today's presentation might have sparked.
So more pictures, you're saying? Okay. All right.
Or
Thank you.
videos.
Okay.
All right, everybody.
And I just have one more quick question. Is there any way that I can get some way to get in touch with people who were members of that golf club or is there a way that, or do you have any access to anything that I could dig into to get some information about, history? Or don't you know?
We have a number of the disciplines that have been studying the site, be it surveying, engineering, wetlands, topography. I mean, there have been a number of disciplines that have touched the history of the site. If you're particularly thinking about the sociocultural history of the golf course, we may have some leads.
Okay, well, it doesn't have to be.
I don't know that it's like at the Historical Society I can point you to. Some of it might be, and we have some informal documentation from stuff we've recovered or received when we bought the property.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, thank you. And see you next 2 weeks from now.
Thanks.
On Zoom, right? On the same site, right?
Yes. Hopefully that'll be our last Zoom. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Yep.
Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
See you, everyone.
Thanks all. Take care.
That's what I got into, create one, okay.